I'm David Leighton Brown. I'm the Master of Ceremonies here today. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees of WES and the chair of the advisory group to our Canadian operation. And even if I had nothing to do with WES, I would really be impressed with what WES is doing that we're going to be hearing about today. All of you are too, or you wouldn't be here. And so I know you've come not to hear me, but the substance of the occasion, so I just have some housekeeping things to let you all know. First of all, as you can tell from the cameras and the bank of technicians beside me, this is a live event. It is being webcast, podcast, made available online if we have our internet connection re-established, which is being worked on feverishly as I speak, and hopefully by the time I finish my introduction it will indeed be being broadcast online. And we are expecting input from the people online throughout the occasion, so it really does matter to us that that functions. Let me give you a quick overview of what is to happen. When I finally stop talking, we will have some presentations from members of the WES staff. We will have presentations from a panel of partner organizations. You know who you are. After a break, we will divide up into smaller table discussions, finish with a brief wrap-up of reports from those table discussions, and conclude with lunch. What I haven't said is the really exciting and productive ideas that we're going to be dealing with in the course of the morning. Last thing I should say, my notes remind me to tell you, you all will want to know where the washrooms are. And it's important for me to explain because they're not on this floor. There are washrooms one floor up and one floor down. So do not wander around on this floor looking for one. We're going to begin with a presentation from Sulaf Al-Sheikli, who is WES's area expert on the people with whom today's subject is focused. So I will turn things over to Sulaf and hope that the people online will also see your presentation.
Thank you, David, and good morning, everyone. Our plan for today starts with a brief overview of the refugee crisis in general around the world, and we will focus after that a little bit on the Syrian crisis and the challenges in credential assessment and recognition for refugees from these countries. We will also share recent research on best practices for institutions that assess refugee credentials and share some options regarding what institutions can do to overcome recognition challenges. In addition, we will share our plans to develop an alternative assessment process for refugees who do not meet WES standard documentation requirements. This work is still in progress, and we definitely appreciate your feedback and input to better enhance our process. So, the refugee situation around the world. Currently, worldwide, there's over 15 million refugees. As you can see from the list, Syria is the #1 country. The list also includes a number of countries in Africa, Myanmar, and Iraq. These are the numbers from the UNHCR, and these numbers are from mid-2015. So this only counts refugees who are people displaced from their home countries, and currently residing in camps outside of their countries of origin. This doesn't count people who are internally displaced. If we take into consideration people internally displaced, refugees in camps, asylees all around the world, the number is actually way more than 15 million. It's close to 60 million, which is a huge number. So there has been efforts to resettle refugees in Canada and the US. Canada has taken in about 26,000 Syrian refugees this year. The United States is planning on taking about 10,000 this year. The ones who actually got into the US so far is about 1,300. So why assess refugee credentials? The prime reason for this is that many refugees are often underemployed. You've heard all these stories about the doctors who are working as cab drivers or the engineers who are working in basic jobs in factories. This happens for various reasons, but the main reason is that their credentials from their home countries are not actually recognized in the host country. So recognizing these credentials is actually really important, because once the refugees' credentials are recognized in the host countries, they can work in jobs that pay more income. Higher income means paying more taxes, contributing more to the economy of the host communities, and also it helps with basic dignity for the people when they feel that they're actually working in a job that's commensurate with their level of education. The same thing works for students where their studies were interrupted in their home countries because of crisis, and then if they feel that they have a way to continue these studies from where they left off in the host countries, that would be really beneficial for them and for the communities they're in. The other reason that assessing refugee credentials is really important, it's that is required by international law. Canada and the US are both signatories on the Lisbon Convention from 1997, which includes a lot of Western countries, and it actually mandates that foreign educated and trained individuals receive fair credential assessment, and this includes refugees with limited documentation and with no documentations at all, to try to get their qualifications recognized. So it's important for US and Canada to fulfill their international obligations to refugees and asylees in this sense. Challenges in assessing refugee credentials. So what are the challenges that institutions might face if they want to assess refugee credentials? So refugees most of the time flee their countries really fast. They're not prepared. They don't take too many documents with them. They might have some or they might have nothing. So since institutions in the US and Canada rely on official documentation in order to recognize credentials, this will pose a challenge for institutions when the refugees come in with limited documentation or unofficial documentation. The other challenge would be if the institution is destroyed or closed, not functioning, then the student won't be able to get their documents from their institution in order to present them to institutions in the US and Canada. The other thing would be, even if the institution was open, they might not be responsive, or the applicants themselves or the refugee applicants might have well-founded fear of actually going to the school or sending someone on their behalf from their relatives to go and acquire the documents directly from the institution. So these are many of the things that actually pose a challenge to the institution when the refugees don't have enough documentation. The main thing to keep in mind is refugees, when they come in, they might come with a range of documents. You never know what they will possess. They might come with 1 or 2 documents, they might come with full documentation, they might come with nothing at all. Or they might be able to acquire the documents and they might not. So it's good to keep in mind that we need to treat these cases on a case-by-case basis, because each refugee applicant has a different situation than everyone else. So WES's experience with documents from Syria so far. So I'll start first by mentioning what is WES's current documentation requirements for standard evaluations. Usually WES requires documents to come in a sealed institution envelope from the institution attended. That's usually for higher education. And for the documents to be in a Ministry of Education envelope for secondary level education. So our experience so far that we do continue to receive documents from Syria. So we receive documents from the Ministry of Education for secondary, and we do receive documents from higher education institutes as well. They do have over 243 institutions. These institutions are public universities, public institutes, private universities. Some of them are currently functioning and some of them are not. So we do receive these documents. They usually are in Arabic language. They're not the reissued to be sent to us. Most of the time they are attested photocopies of the documents that were issued to the applicant at the time they graduated. Some private institutes might issue the documents in English, but most of the time it's in Arabic. The other thing would be, even though I'm mentioning that we do receive documents directly from institutions in Syria, this doesn't really apply to every school and every student, because many institutions might be destroyed, not functioning, or in areas where it's really hard to reach. So it's also a case by case. Some refugees might be able, refugees or students, applicants, depending on who's applying, they might be able to get the documents directly, but that's not the case for everyone. That's why we have to look at this again and see if there is any other way to help the ones who can't actually get their documents. So barriers to recognition of refugee credentials. So like we mentioned, since the institutions in the US and Canada do rely on documents being direct, so once the applicant cannot provide these documents, they can't really do much to help them. There isn't much flexibility in helping them or recognizing the documents that they're presenting, since they're not complete documents. And in some cases, when the documents or the refugees do have gaps in their educational record, there is another challenge for the institution, which is how to actually fill those gaps in the academic record and what to do in that case. Usually, in order to fill gaps in the academic record for a refugee with limited documentation or partial documentation, This requires deep knowledge of the country of education, the way documents are issued in the home country. You might need also language skills, since translations are not always very accurate. You might need course syllabi, and also trying to work with unofficial or partial documents will require additional steps to be taken in order to produce an assessment to that qualification, and will require additional research to corroborate the evidence and the documents that the refugee might present to support the claim of their credential. So what our research tells us so far is alternative assessment methods are being done. Mostly the research that we've done since last fall at WES. We gathered all the literature that we could find on this topic, and it was mostly from Europe, who had a lot of research and literature published on this topic. And then we gathered the best practices that we could find. We also interviewed institutions, we interviewed licensing boards, we interviewed people in Canada, the US, and in Europe in order to gather enough information for this research. And this same research that we conducted it's good to note that this research is also being used by WES to inform our new process in order to find a way to evaluate refugee credentials. So the summary of the best practices that most of the people we met agreed on was to create a profile for the refugee applicant using the documents that they have on hand and at the same time what they claim that they have, because sometimes they might not have enough documents to prove their claim. Also, the other thing that many use is a portfolio of evidence where they gather supporting documents that support the claim of the credentials the applicant has. And then what they do is some sort of an assessment of the documents available, the knowledge they have, the supporting evidence, and come up with an assessment report for the credentials from the refugee applicant. So once this assessment report is produced, so if this assessment report is presented to an institute or an employer and they feel that they still need to double check or make sure that certain skills are there for their profession or whatever institute they're applying to, then they can use a competency assessment. Competency assessment could be one of many things. So after receiving the assessment report, if the institution feels they need to make sure, for example, that the applicant is good with math, they can conduct examinations, for example. So if the applicant actually passes a comprehensive math examination, they can exempt the applicant from credits for that course or maybe whatever prerequisites for that course. Another thing institutions can do to assess competency would be interviews. So for example, they can sit the refugee applicant with one or two experts in the field or professors. They can ask them questions, interview them, check their level of knowledge in that particular field, and then those people who interviewed the applicant can recommend placement or credit or admitting that applicant to a certain level or a certain program. Sample work or thesis, that's another way to assess competencies, and this works well with higher level applicants, let's say if it's a PhD level applicant. So review of their thesis can be a way of assessing their level of competency. In other cases, also for graduate studies, applicants can, if they don't have any published research, for example, that the school can look at, can be given special projects to work on, and in those cases that would show their level of expertise. Skills assessment, this is best used in cases where it's professional skills that we're trying to assess, and in those cases simulation can be used for certain tasks that a person in this level is supposed to be able to complete. So these are some of the ways that institutions can use to assess competencies in addition to the assessment that they received if they need to go further after the assessment. Best practices for determining recognition. Now that we have the assessment report and then we assessed the competencies for the refugees if needed, the other thing would be, or the following step would be, determining recognition. So institutions can actually either fully, if they don't fully recognize a credential from a refugee applicant, then they can go, for example, with alternative recognition. Alternative recognition is mostly in cases where the institute cannot actually corroborate the full credential to accept it. For example, if an applicant claims that they're a pharmacist in their home country and the institution cannot really corroborate that fully, they might be able to recognize that they do have enough knowledge to work somewhere else in the field, for example, like a pharmacist assistant, and then in that case they can start at least from some point and they can work their way up to gain their previous status or the credential that they actually had, but at least they're not going to start from scratch. They're going to start from somewhere. Conditional recognition is another option that institutions can do if they're not willing to grant full recognition. In this case, for example, a student can be admitted as a transfer student in a certain level, and then that would be conditional. For example, if the student is admitted, that they have to, you can put a condition that they have to pass all the courses in the first semester with a minimum of a B. So that could be an example, and if they do, then they can proceed from that level on after we admitted them to the level that they claim they have. Partial recognition could be another way where, for example, an applicant claims that they have, let's say, an MBA. You can't take the full credential, then parts of it that you do recognize, you can give them credits for that, and then they can only repeat or continue the other parts that were not recognized instead of repeating the whole thing. So after we worked on assessing the credential, and then we worked on assessing competencies afterwards if needed, and they got some sort of recognition, what institutions can actually do is consider more flexible policies in trying to recognize refugee credentials to see if there's any way that we don't push them back to start from the very beginning. That's the only thing we're trying to avoid, since this is very time-consuming and requires a lot of effort, and it's actually very draining to the refugees. And there's no need for them to start from the very beginning if we are able to recognize what they have so far. And this actually gives them a way to proceed forward, to integrate in their new communities faster and better. And with this last thought, I'll turn the presentation over to Timothy Owen, and he will share a little bit more about what WES is doing to help.
Thank you, Sulav. So we have a number of questions for us here today, and certainly thank you for being here to help us answer them. We're really believing that not can we innovate and be more flexible, but how can we be more flexible? And we're going to be asking you to take a look at some possibilities there, and look at how we can use alternative assessment processes within our institutions to be able to help refugees. There are a lot of different players in here, and that's why we brought together a group of people from different sectors, from community agencies, from academic institutions, from regulatory bodies, because we each play a role. I don't believe we have any employers here, but of course that's the other major player, and the end result is to help people find employment in their own field. But a lot of the community agencies that we're working with will be also helping us in terms of moving people into that area. We also want to find out what kind of additional research we need to have. Do we have enough information? Do we need more? I mean, there's going to be ongoing research as we move forward, but we want to identify some points in there. Are there other resources that we haven't identified? Financial, human, organizational resources. And I think in the end result is we want to know as WES, like, where do we fit into this process? We know that we work with all of you in different ways. We provide one input, one tool that you use, and we want to look a little bit more on what we can do to help in this particular respect. Just to look a little bit more on what refugees are, what their educational background, what their profile is in Canada. On the left-hand side, you see for the last 5 years what the educational attainment of refugees in Canada has been, and on the right, the Syrians. The numbers actually are fairly similar. I mean, the profile of the Syrian refugee in Canada is not dissimilar from the refugee population that we've seen in the past. About 65% of refugees coming to Canada over the past 5 years only have secondary school or less. It's about 70% for Syrians. And on the other hand, it's just over 20% of refugees coming to Canada and of Syrian refugees have some post-secondary education. So although we have a very large group that's come in very quickly, in many ways not dissimilar from the refugee population that Canada's been seeing in the past. However, there's two different groups of refugees coming in from Syria: the government-assisted refugees and the privately sponsored refugees. Now, these numbers reflect about 15,000 people who've been approved by about January. We've got government numbers here, and then numbers change all the time in terms of new people coming in. But it's a very stark difference. I mean, if you can see that government-assisted refugees, their families are very large. 52%, 53% had more than 5 people on their application, whereas with the privately sponsored group, 50% had just 1. Much younger in the government-assisted, probably because they have large families, but 56% are 14 years of age or younger, whereas the privately sponsored, over 50% are of working age, 25 to 64. The language capacity, again, just mirror images of one another. And in terms of the number of people that have completed post-secondary education, 6% of the government-assisted and 37% of the privately sponsored. I mean, part of the challenge here is that we can see this kind of in a graphic form, the same number. Part of the challenge is, the government-assisted refugees are coming through settlement agencies. They're hosted for a couple of weeks before they find homes on their own, but they do have some very strong support. In the privately sponsored, the support is a bit more, it's not as centralized. I mean, people have support from the family or the group that sponsored them, but they're not necessarily connected in the same way to a community agency as the way in which people that come in under government-assisted programs are. So there's a bit of a challenge for us, I think, and for all of us to identify and make sure that those people get streamed into support services that are available for them. So when we were looking at what we could do to help and move the agenda forward that Sulif was talking about, was to bring together a group of stakeholders, and we're very fortunate that we work with so many different stakeholders in our work, whether it's academic institutions or regulatory bodies or community agencies, and it's always good to bring them together to hear their views and how we can play, and what role we can play. We want to share some of the research that we've done. We've done that through what Sulif's presentation, but also in your kit and online. We have a much more in-depth research document that you'll be able to look at. And of course our plan here is to how can we assess refugee credentials in the future. The pilot project that we've talked about is one that while we have a model and a process, we really want to move forward and develop it more collaboratively with you. This is a very different approach for WES. As many of you know, we've had very strict documentation requirements, and that has meant that it's really a systemic barrier for those people that can't access those documents to get an assessment from WES to move forward. And in some cases, an assessment from WES is required, both for admission to institutions or for admission to a regulatory body. So, I mean, while we still believe that our documentation process is a very valuable one, and that for any individual coming in to Canada in a refugee situation, the first attempt will be to help them get the documents that we require. A formal document, a formal WES assessment with full verification is going to be the most valuable thing that they can have. And so that should be the first step to encourage those people who can obtain official documents to do so. On the other hand, there's going to be a lot of people, as we know, who can't. And so this alternative process is going to be based on what evidence we can find. And we will begin with some evidence. It won't just be based on a claim with no documents to back that up. We'll have to build it from something. Some people will have full documents that just aren't verifiable, and some will have partial documentation from which we'll have to reconstruct an academic history. But in all cases, we'll use our own knowledge and our research about the educational system in question to be able to rebuild and provide a report that can be used by end users to further the individual's goals. We're going to be testing this process with you and with others over the next 6 months. We have identified some partners already across Canada, and after today's session we'll be looking to identify more so that we can have a very focused pilot project that we can use to build this process in the future. The first most important part of this will be to identify people who should be screened into the process. I mean, we recognize that people are coming in as refugees with different types of documents which proves their refugee status. So rather than trying to say that you have to have one particular document, we're going to be asking people to be referred specifically from an agency that's working with refugees. So they'll either be having people who are government assisted or privately sponsored, and we'll be asking for a screen for that, and that they can't get their full documentation. We're going to be looking at Syrian refugees in this pilot project, although the model is to go forward to look at a broader group of people in the future who are refugees or in refugee-like situations from other countries. But for this particular pilot project, we want to focus on Syrian refugees, and we want them to have people who have completed at least grade 10. So at least they're eligible to get into apprenticeship programs, at least as a minimum. We're going to, after the screening process, have an application for which we're going to be looking for the documentation that they have and for any evidence that backs up their claim. We're going to have to do that in person. We want to make sure we get as much information as we can. This is why we're going to limit the scope so that we can do this a bit more in depth. I think at that stage, having a little bit of an interview with the individual will help us determine their circumstances and broaden our understanding of their claim and what evidence they have to support it. And then based on what Sulaf was saying, we'll try to reconstruct their history to the best that we can and provide evidence that we have identified. So we will advise in our report what we believe the educational equivalency is. We will indicate what evidence we have to support that and the methodology that we use to come to that decision. The report will contain in electronic form the information that we've used to the documents that have been submitted so that the end user will be able to see it as well. And we'll also be able to provide contextual information about the education system in Syria so that the referring or the referred organization will be able to understand a little bit more fully. So the next steps are really what we're here to discuss. I mean, we're going to kind of, extrapolate from this today and to develop this project. We want to hear from you about some of the challenges. We're going to need partners to refer people to us. As we mentioned, we're going to need to work with the educational institutions and regulatory bodies to determine the utility of the report, what else would need to be in it, what else the organizations that are accepting our assessment would need to do to be able to determine the best placement for the individual, and then also work with community organizations to help people find appropriate employment based on the level of education that they have. So we're starting this project here in Canada with Syrian refugees. As I said, we're going to be hoping to expand it after the pilot stage for all people in refugee-like situations, and also to be able to use this in the United States. We have a contact email address there, refugees@wes.org, if people are looking for more information about this project. Online, and there's also, I'm not sure whether is it in the USB pen, this report? There's the research report recognizing refugee credentials, practical tips, so you can download that from the pen in your kit, or it'll be online on our website, and you have an executive summary of that in your kit. I think we're going to save questions until after the panel discussion because I think we're a little bit short in time. So I think what we'll do is just ask the three panelists to come up to these chairs, and as they do that, I'll introduce them. Alex Irwin is the director of the School of Immigrant and Transitional Education at George Brown College. We've been working with him lots of times, and he's also the chair of the Ontario College Sector Immigrant Programs and Services Committee. Dana Wagner, who's sitting down just beside him, is a senior research associate with the Global Diversity Exchange, GDX, at Ryerson University, and she's also the project manager for the Higher Immigrant Program there. And Shireen Mirjabar is which is the acting senior credentialing officer at the Canadian Alliance of Physiotherapy Regulators, another partner of ours for many years. So what we're going to ask, I should stand here before I say what we're going to ask each of the panelists to do is to just reflect on what they've heard, indicate what kind of elements of the assessment that we're talking about would work for them, but also what other considerations and concerns they have, what are the challenges they see with such an assessment as well as the opportunities. And I think after that we'll give them a chance to ask each other a question or two, but open it up to the floor, and I think we have lots of time to do that.
Testing. Hi, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a background of the Canadian Alliance of Physiotherapy Regulators. We're actually not the regulatory body, but we conduct a very important work on behalf of most of the regulators for physiotherapy across Canada. So we evaluate credentials for foreign trained physiotherapists, but we also administer the physiotherapy competency exam for both Canadians and internationally trained physiotherapists. So I just wanted to kind of introduce that so you can understand the perspective that we're coming from. So I'm just going to talk to you guys about what we think of WES's alternative documents program for Syrian refugees, what we think might work for us, where we may find some challenges or gaps. Overall, we think that WES's program seems to be very good. A lot of their suggestions kind of line up with our own guidelines and policies for refugees. So, for example, having sworn statements and affidavits would be very useful. if they have any sample documents, if applicants have transcripts, curriculum or syllabi. We think that that would be very helpful. Definitely maybe having some sort of special application specifically for refugees would be helpful as well. We do think it's important that we only go through the alternative document route if an applicant absolutely can't get documents. So I know when I was reading the WES report, it stated that one of the first approaches is to try to actually ensure that the applicant can get documents. And in the presentation, we also heard that some institutions are able to issue it, so we'd want to make sure we do a thorough check to ensure that they absolutely can't get the documents before we go into that route. In terms of us being profession-specific, we'd also want to get witness statements or testimonials for someone who can testify specific claims. So it could come from school officials or professors. Definitely getting some information about professional license or membership information. We actually haven't seen a credential from Syria, so that's a bit of a challenge as well. Just with the very little research we've done so far, we do know that there is a Syrian Physical Therapy Association, so there's not much about it. There's a few contacts, but if we were able to get some information about membership with that organization, that would be helpful. I definitely think assessing competencies could be helpful as well. We are actually fortunate that we do have a safeguard in place to protect the public. We do have the physiotherapy competency exam, which everyone would have to take, so that would ensure that they'd be safe to practice before they apply for their license. But there are some concerns with exam security, so we do want to make sure that these applicants that are coming in with few documents, we don't want to have too many unqualified applicants having exposure to our exam, which is very expensive and extensive to produce. In terms of other options that would work for us, maybe that WES haven't mentioned, because it's related to a health profession. Often for physiotherapists, they take clinical practice, they do clinical internships. So if we can get information about that, that would be very helpful. Also, I think what would also be useful is, because we don't really know much about physiotherapy in Syria, reaching out to our physiotherapy counterparts in other parts of the world, the US or Europe, seeing if they've seen Syrian physiotherapy credentials before would be really helpful for us. I guess some of the challenges we have is that we would need to learn more about physiotherapy in Syria. It would be difficult for us to corroborate documents because we've never seen a Syrian credential, so we would really have to work with partners like WES to understand what credentials would look like from Syria. And we would also have to conduct our own research as well. I'm just trying to see if there's anything else. I do want to make one more point, actually, and it has to relate to the different levels of recognition. So I believe they briefly touched upon it: alternative, partial, full recognition. I think that it would be difficult, I think, for us to give full recognition per se, especially if we're not 100% sure that we can verify documents. But we might want to consider something like conditional recognition that might work more for our organization. So conditional can be maybe two different things. One could be, maybe they have to go to a bridging program before they can go to the exam, or it could be conditional registration once they get to the licensing stage, and it might be up to the regulatory body to determine what kind of conditions they can put on them. But overall, we think it's a good process, and we just need to get a little bit more research, I think, on this and work with the community. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Again, my name is Dana Wagner, and I'm with the Global Diversity Exchange at Ryerson University. I'm glad this wasn't called a panel of experts. It's a panel of partner institutions, so thank you for that. So I suppose what I was asked to speak to today was just a little bit of the perspective that my organization has gained working with Syrian newcomers in the GTA, other refugee groups, and then the program that I manage is employer-facing. So a few observations just on engaging employers on similar topics. And I understand that WES will be beginning an engagement process with employers as well. So just to consider these, maybe some preliminary observations to consider. A general overall comment is just to thank WES for taking this step. I think it's just an incredibly important initiative. We've got, I think everyone in this room knows this, but it's important to note too that there is hard research on the fact that when people have their full recognition, it adds to higher earnings and lower likelihood of working in a job that you're overqualified for. I think we all know that, but it's never, it's always important to reinforce that we do have the evidence on that. I think that, again, just an opening observation is that I think we're looking at two problems here. One is about, or potential problems that WES is going to be dealing with. One is the credibility and recognition of this specific procedure, but I think it can't be detached from the problem of recognition overall of non-OECD credentials. So to keep in mind that these two issues are very closely linked. And so a number of questions that a colleague had put up on the PowerPoint slides earlier, like can we be innovative, can we find an alternative process? I think the answer is yes, it's eminently doable. There's good practice developed in other jurisdictions. But again, I think the important question to ask is, does it overcome other barriers? Can we build this consensus on the value and worth, not only on this procedure, but overall? So how do we kind of kill two birds with one stone, I suppose? So a few observations just from the client perspective. Just again, some work that we're doing with Syrian newcomers in the city and what we're seeing. I think awareness of the service is, of course, going to be a major issue to confront. The earlier the better, of course. Early intervention has emerged as a best practice in European jurisdictions, especially in terms of actually getting credentials recognized at a really, really early entry point. Like literally it's embedded within the asylum assessment procedures in some jurisdictions. And of course, just how important this is to make sure that we don't lose people. I've been hearing it even just from one-on-one conversations with some of the Syrian newcomers coming in, just looking for alternative work and just expressing almost no confidence that they can get reevaluated, get their credentials recognized and get into a profession that they left. So awareness. A second piece is distinguishing the service that WES provides from other services, I think. And, we know that this is a common problem. There are so many other things out there. How does the client, in terms of an uptake challenge, how does the client recognize that this is something that is actually going to be useful to them? And we know that, generally sometimes when services are attached to government or university, they carry more credibility that way. So to consider some types of partnerships that could be useful here. I also think uptake, we're seeing with this population, highly mobile connected. So uptake, I think, might be more dependent on word of mouth than we have seen in previous groups. So we've got really large online networks, international ones too, like Dubara. Maybe some of us have heard about that really important resource for Syrian newcomers. There's a great article just about some of the Syrian newcomers coming into Ottawa, and there's like a really active WhatsApp group with just really useful communications there for people. So to be considering those types of alternative communications methods. A few observations now on the employer as the end user of this recognition. I think that, again, speaking to my opening observation, across the OECD, employers we know discount qualifications from non-OECD countries, and the research is showing that, again, within OECD countries, work experience that is gained in non-OECD countries is almost dismissed completely. So to just keep in mind how major this challenge is going to be. The second is that overall human resources can be very risk averse, and I think that this speaks to the importance of when engaging employers on what's happening here and the importance of this, the importance of getting executive sponsorship for some of these things. The private sector is just incredibly innovative and a willing partner to engage, but I think it really has to come from the top on something that is quite different and new for the Canadian private sector. A third thing that we're seeing with some of the work that we're doing right now on engaging employers around just kind of alternative paths to employment is really the message that employers won't do extra work. And so that's just maybe more of again, I want to caution this by saying just how innovative and willing employers have been as a partner on Syrian refugee employment in general. But we've also had some very candid feedback. For example, one of the big employers that we're working with, I had a conversation about, how do we make this work? We've got a pile of CVs on one hand and you've got jobs on the other hand. What comes first, the job position or the CV? Like what needs to happen here? And the candid feedback was, I'm not going to come to you. You have to come to me. Essentially put these candidates on a silver platter, hand it to me and say, here's where it fits what you need. So if that's the general method of working, just to realize what's going to have to be, that it's going to take I think a lot of work on the partner service provider end. Now maybe moving from just to a few final comments on just some ideas to incorporate as you develop this pilot, and just a few principles based on what has been maybe working in other jurisdictions as well. What I spoke to about how important it is to embed this at the beginning of a process, so just an early intervention. And it would be so wonderful to include maybe in terms of who you're looking at as eligible in this process, both resettled refugees and also asylum seekers, including among the Syrian population, and what early intervention looks like for both of those groups, to be a bit creative about that. So for asylum seekers, again, it can be right as they're going through this claimant process, but for our resettled refugee population, as far as I'm aware, I haven't seen anything that's been piloted right now in terms of pre-arrival work on this file. So to even think completely outside of the box like that, and we know that we've got people sitting overseas right now who are destined to Canada. So why can't this work begin before people arrive? Second thing is, again, I think, Alex, I'll leave maybe the communication bit to you, but just how important that is going to be. A good practice that's emerged from Austria, one of the countries that's been doing a lot of work on this, is actually hosting training within companies to advertise the service. And just a second piece on communication. In terms of the buy-in of something like this, I think, are continuing to use words like the foreign credential recognition, and even just switching from a word like foreign to international. There can be simple tweaks like that can make a lot of difference. Finally, from thinking about the employer as an end user, is to really think about as many ways as possible to embed that end user, the employer, into assessment, and this can be, again, done in really innovative ways. I think there's a few good examples, again, from other jurisdictions where employers are actually involved in the skills and qualifications assessment. So for instance, in Germany, a part of the assessment procedure is actually based on samples of work that is undertaken with an employer. In Norway, there's an example of the same type of procedure that's happening, but what they do is convene a panel of experts, and on that panel of experts are, of course, private sector partners. So it's really putting like a very official stamp of approval on something like this at a very high level. And the value of doing something like this, I think it again ticks a few really important boxes. If something like a skills assessment that involves a private sector partner is built into the process, that gives also the client the added value of building in some Canadian work experience at the same time. So I'll stop there and pass it over to Alex.
Thanks. Well, I won't speak for too long, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about sort of the perspective from colleges specifically, but I think it would be more broadly about sort of admissions to post-secondary education and the value of the project. And first of all, just to also echo that this is such an incredibly valuable project. I think we've just started to get a trickle of Syrians to George Brown, in any case, I think into the college system, and most of those are privately sponsored for reasons that we are all aware of. I think just the support that they receive, and often they come in with their sponsors. I think, but what we do see is a group that has experienced a lot more, of course, dislocation and various forms of trauma than what we're often used to with newcomers. And that gets to one of my points, which is that, these two different groups that we talk about, private and publicly sponsored, sort of reflects part of the adjustment that we're going through, period, in the college system, because we're used to a system that's really geared towards internationally trained immigrants with our bridging programs and our sociocultural programming, and people who come in with quite a bit of post-secondary education already. And now we're, hopefully having a group that's starting to arrive that will need more basic literacy work, and we are well positioned for that. We have access programming, that's the division I'm in. We have academic upgrading, which is provincial programming. We have a lot of pre-programs. Those programs, however, are not really designed or adapted to working interculturally and working with a lot of newcomers. So that's a sort of a challenge, and an interesting challenge that we're sort of hopefully going to be facing in the college system. And in a couple of weeks, I'm actually speaking at a provincial conference with the academic upgrading college faculty and managers, and we're trying to sort of get people oriented to that new reality. But in this case, we're talking about profile of individual who fits potentially more what we're used to, which is someone who has higher education, but in this case doesn't have that credential to show. And so, it's a lot of this has already been said, but I think it's going to, of course, just take massive institutional and system buy-in for any kind of new tool to be recognized, and that's going to involve bringing into the fold pretty quickly admissions and the registrar's office in systemically around the province, so that they have some say in how this product is produced, and then the buy-in is there. And I think it's an open question as to how early you involve some of those individuals, because you want to present them with something that they can that resonates and that they can use and feel and move forward with. So I would recommend involving a handful of key people early on from those sectors of the college and university systems. The other thing is that in colleges in Ontario we have a pretty strong recognition of prior learning system, and that's a way in which we provide people academic credit for knowledge and experience they have. That's not exemptions for courses they've taken in the past. This is a way of giving people credit through challenge exams, through interviews, through portfolio development, to give them an actual credit on a transcript. So I feel like that system is always in need of more development, and it's very exciting when it works well. But I feel like that could be a key to, or at least an important element to this development of this project, because we have that in place already. If you have someone who comes into the college system, in any case, with a partial credential, as we've been discussing, perhaps the rest of it could be completed through our existing RPL or PLAR processes. Some of the learnings from that also could be applied just to the development of this. I think, the last thing I'll say, and we can talk more once we get into Q&A, but is that I think any product that comes from WES is going to be looked at with great respect. But I also see that there's risks, because this is going out on a limb into a new project area. So you, of course, don't want to squander any of your credibility on that. So that's there. But I think that the fact that there's so many international models in place is also extremely powerful, and needs to be highlighted, particularly when you get down to some of the institutional barriers that will be in place. So, but I, as everyone has said, applaud this effort. It's wonderful.
Thank you very much for all of your input. Before we go into a broad Q&A, I'm just wondering if any of you have questions for each other before we open it up to the floor.
I'm just curious from both of my colleagues if you have your own precedents for something like this. Like, are there similar either waves of people or other country contexts that you've dealt with before that are similar?
Similar in terms of the in terms of the lack of credentials. I mean, I think that, as I said, the PLAR process is the closest we come to that. People coming in lacking, and I'm sure if we talk to the people who work in that area at George Brown, they would say that yes, we have people coming in who say they have this credential and they don't have proof, and so we use the PLAR process to do our best to provide them with something. Yeah.
We do have a policy in place or guidelines for people that are refugees or have lack of documents. I personally haven't really dealt with very much of it. We have in the past. I know, for example, there was one case where I dealt with. She wasn't a refugee, but she had lack of documents, and she was educated in the UK. So we used some of the options that you could use, like a sworn statement, getting documents from the applicant. So we've had a little bit of experience, but not particularly, like not a lot, and not with Syrians.
I guess I have a question, or more of a just, it's a larger question which involves industry, which is just, I'm focused on the post-secondary element and getting admissions and the registrar's office on board institutionally. But then what? Then moving forward, as we've said, will employers recognize this credential? How will this credential appear, and in what form? And maybe that's a question for Tim.
No, I think that's a very good question. What we've heard from employers in the past, is that if somebody is licensed by a regulatory body, that for them is a proxy for competence. So the credential that maybe went into the licensing process is probably not as important as the license that they got from the body. I think for employers, probably the biggest challenge is for those that are in the unregulated field, in which their resume and a credential assessment is the only thing they have. And I think that challenge is probably it's similar to what all internationally trained people face. As Dana said, if you're from a non-OECD country, employers are going to feel that hiring you is a different level of risk than it would be for somebody from a country that they're more familiar with. And I think the work that we do in partnership with community organizations in terms of trying to expand the awareness of employers about the breadth of excellent education around the world is something that's an ongoing piece of work to try to help minimize what they perceive as a higher risk. And if they come through an educational institution, and we also have found that people who have even like a postgraduate certificate from a college that sits on top of the credential they've earned from another country, that one piece of Canadian credential, adds value to the credential they've earned from somewhere else. And so I think to those who go through either a regulatory body or an academic institution, they're going to come out with something that employers will recognize. It's for those that are going straight into employment that's unregulated that I think we have to work harder on that employer engagement piece.
Passing the mic around for a very quick comment on that, which is just that, in the college system, about 30% at George Brown, in any case, of our students already have, some sort of post-secondary credential. So I think that's also the value in this, which is that, although we have wonderful bridging programs in the system, the majority of immigrants go into post-grad certificates. Those who are internationally trained and have BAs, for instance, and I think access to that is key. So if they could get into one of those post-grad certificates, perhaps that original credential wouldn't be it wouldn't matter quite as much, I guess.
Let's open it up to the floor. If you have any questions or comments about what you've heard either from Sula, or myself, or from any of the panelists, there is, I think, one or two mics that are going to be taken around the table. So put your hand up and somebody will identify you and take a mic to you. There's a question.
My name is Mahmoud Sulaiman from the Pharmacy Examining Board of Canada. First of all, I'd like to say, as a Syrian myself, I do commend the efforts of WES and all the partner organizations in terms of taking on this commitment head-on to help support the challenges that Syrian people face. From the perspective of credentialing, though, to what extent do you feel that there's a need, like the level of transparency that's required to inform the candidates that these options are available without putting yourself at risk of having people try to go through this pathway as opposed to our more, the pathways that we're more confident with?
Well, from the research that we've done in terms of best practices, I suppose, in Europe, certainly the key first step is to ensure that people don't see the alternative assessment as the first choice. And then that's kind of a hard balancing act, because what you're really saying is that it's not worth as much as going through the formal process. But on the other hand, you want it to be worth something, because you want a person to get recognition if they can't find the documents. So that is a challenge, but it is, I think, that's why I think the first step is not something that is necessarily best done without some kind of personal intervention. I think the individual has to be encouraged to look to find the best case, which is to get the documents sent directly, and only if that's not possible or unsafe to put them through the alternative assessment. And I think that's something that only practice will teach us in terms of what the best way to approach that is. It is going to be a one-on-one situation. It's going to be different for every individual. So that's not something we can answer now, but I think it's the biggest challenge.
I was going to say, I do agree with what Tim is saying as well. It's really hard to put that out there. You don't want applicants to just go straight to the alternative path if they can go through the regular one. I think having some policies in place would be helpful. Maybe, I guess in terms of our organization, we don't currently have it published, but I mean, we do have it available if we have applicants that follow that route. So we can always make that available to the applicants that are qualified for it, so that way we're being transparent, but to the ones that are qualified, I guess.
Actually, just wanted to get back to that issue of transparency, because it just reminds me, we went through a process a few years ago with a group of regulators in coming up with best documentation practices, and we did imagine this scenario, and we kind of called it Plan B. But there was a real reluctance to put the criteria for that alternative assessment on, publicly, because the fear was that everybody would take that route because it was seen to be easier. So there is that other balance of how public can you make something that you really don't think should be the first choice. And I don't think we have a good answer for that, but that's what I'm hoping we'll hear from the regulators who use these alternative assessment processes already. I mean, because that's much more, I guess, a requirement for a regulator to be able to have an assessment for anybody that comes, not just for those that meet all the documentation requirements. So we'll learn from your experience, I hope.
Good morning. My question regards perhaps a perspective from a refugee who I've spoken to many of them. We offer education from the Wagner Institute of Education at the University Health Network. And our assessment of credentials is very heavily dependent on getting WES evaluations from our applicants. And I was wondering, because a lot of refugees face a lot of barriers that we haven't discussed today as far as cost goes in obtaining these documents, whether there's any funding built into your pilot project to give discounts for refugees to get these types of alternative assessments or take part in your pilot project?
Well, thank you for that question, because one of the things I neglected to say was that we're waiving all fees for the pilot project, so it will be free for anybody who's involved in it, which is one of the reasons we have to limit the scope. But yes, it won't be. There'll be no charge at that point.
So I just have a comment to your question. I represent the Immigrant Access Fund of Canada, and what we do is provide loans under very favorable conditions for people who are immigrants or refugees and need to take their educational credentials. So for anybody else who may be facing the same problem with people applying to you, we may talk in the break. Thank you.
I'm Lizette Joffrey. I'm with the Office of the Fairness Commissioner here in Toronto. And under our fair access legislation, there is a requirement that the regulatory bodies provide information for which documentation is acceptable as an alternative. And there's been a lot of back and forth with regulators about making that information available up front. But many of them do. Many of them actually post that information on their websites in terms of circumstances where an individual is unable to provide original documentation, what the acceptable alternatives are. And some will say, in those circumstances, contact the regulatory body. So because it's a requirement in our legislation for regulated professions, it's happening already.
I'm from the Care Center for Internationally Educated Nurses, and I just have a couple of comments that I wanted to make. One was that CARE is currently engaged in a CIC-funded project to outreach nurses while they are still in country of origin, to facilitate the kinds of processes that we're talking about, to try to acquire original documentation and to really move that process forward. So I think there may be some collaboration and some shared learnings there that could be helpful on both sides. And the other thing I wanted to mention around the transparency and the sharing of information regarding alternative assessment methods. I have some difficulty with not telling people what's available. And I think with clearly articulated criteria and policies, people are then well informed. If anyone ever has been engaged in a PLAR process, don't for 1 minute think it's easier, because indeed it's not. It's quite an exhaustive process. So as I say, I would rather see clearly articulated criteria than something that says, if you can't meet these criteria, give us a call.
I think there was a question over on this table. A woman in the orange sweater.
Hi, I just had a follow-up question from your question about the costs associated. That's great to hear that they're going to be waived. Just curious about if you're getting any documentation that's in Arabic or a different language. What about the translation costs? Are those going to be covered as well? Because sometimes those can be quite daunting to undertake as well. Thanks.
I don't think I have a full answer for you. I mean, we do have people in-house who can do translation, but that it might become unwieldy depending on the volume. So I think we're going to, we'll probably be looking at ways to either minimize or eliminate the cost for translation, certainly during the pilot project. But in a normal course of events, we haven't decided how we're going to apply this process on an ongoing basis, but you're right, translation costs can be the most costly part of the whole assessment. Any other questions or comments before? One more here. One at the front table.
Hi, I'm Christy from Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. And I just have a question about the next step. So we're talking a lot about the documentation, but from the institution's perspective, are there policies or changes to your guidelines around the types of marks that these students are getting and what might be waived. What we have seen is, their high school or earlier on education might have been better, produced better marks, but their most recent have not been good, show some failures or some not great marks, which would normally mean they're not admissible to our universities. And I just don't know if people are waiving that, or if there's a humanitarian piece that's being brought into that, or if that's not something you want to address today. I'm not sure, Tim.
Well, I'll begin to address it, but I think you're right that part of the process of developing this pilot will be to perhaps give some guidelines or guidance to institutions about how to handle situations like that. I think as we heard from Sulaf, one of the key elements of an alternative process is for institutions to show flexibility. And if that means, trying to understand that the person's educational history was disrupted because of certain circumstances which might have impacted on their performance, maybe there's flexibility which can be shown in how those latter grades are reviewed. But I think that's what we'll be looking to get feedback and some suggestions from institutions during the pilot phase. But that's a very good one to look at. I think we're probably ready to close off this session and move into a break. I'll let David take us from there.
Okay, I come bearing good news that we're about to have a break. But before we do that, I just want to observe three themes that to me have emerged from not just the immediate preceding panel, but the entire morning. The first of them is that refugees are not all the same. As Sulaf's original documentation showed, there are not only varieties of age, of family circumstance, of educational background, of experience, of career credentials, but there are variations of available documentation. One size does not fit all. And simply treating the absence of complete documentation as a bar to any kind of opportunity is clearly a disservice to the refugees themselves and a disservice to our entire society. Secondly, alternative assessment is not equal to or even equivalent to full credential assessment. There is no way that it's as good. Anyone who can undergo full credential assessment should. Any end user will prefer full credential assessment to alternative assessment. But alternative assessment is better than no assessment. It provides a basis for flexible judgment that in the absence of alternative assessment does not exist. Third, there is clearly a sense among this group of particularly sensitive, particularly focused people that there's a need for more transparency, for more clear criteria, and that is unquestionably a goal of the pilot project. I think it's unreasonable to expect the pilot project itself to have already developed all of those criteria, but that's what the pilot project is in part for. And I think that needs to be seen explicitly as an outcome we are seeking to build collectively through this pilot project. And there is no doubt that that will be looked for. With that, in 15 minutes' time, we will reconvene. Remember, the washrooms are one floor up, one floor down. There remains coffee and refreshments outside. See you all in 15 minutes. Okay, as I said at the opening of today's event, I'm really good at interrupting fruitful, ongoing discussions. So here I am again. Because we only have a limited amount of time and you only have a limited amount of time, we're going to have to close off these working group table discussions now. I'm going to ask each table in turn to report not on every valuable thing you discussed, but the real highlights in no more than 90 seconds each. And we'll start at that table. Oh, do online first? Okay. We have reestablished our online connection long ago, and we have had an online table group. And Marcus is going to provide those highlights.
Hi everyone. So there were about 40 people online. We did a bit of a chat while you were doing it at the tables. And there were a few key comments. One was a general comment that they'd find the alternative credential assessment useful, that it would provide some hope and contribute to their success, if anything. If they couldn't use it for something like relicensing, they could use it to move forward. Some of the experiences of refugees that many are open to changes and options, so this would be a useful way to start that process. One of the challenges faced is even if documentation could be obtained, it could endanger family abroad, so that would be a major barrier to obtaining that documentation, an important reason to go with an alternative assessment. There was actually, someone mentioned a legal case where someone, I guess it must have been with a licensing body, I'm not sure, where they won the right not to produce a documentation based on that danger. And then the other thing, people would like to know who would accept the alternative assessment once it's available, who would be willing to accept it.
Okay, and I'm not going to introduce table by table. We'll start there, and the microphone will be transported. Please be ready when it gets to you.
A couple of the key takeaways from our table discussion surrounded WES anticipating implementing the initiative and some things to be mindful of. And I think the two key ones that we discussed were that although the alternative assessments may be acceptable for educational or employer purposes, there are still the applicant or the candidate still may encounter other barriers after having their credentials recognized, such as interview processes or having to provide English language proficiencies at certain levels that they may not yet have attained or be capable of coming into the country as new immigrants, and as well a consistency in the post-secondary world in Ontario between colleges and universities about who will accept these assessments and who may not. I don't think the policy has been fine-tuned enough so that there's a general agreement. And we did discuss the fact that WES is reaching out to these educators and other stakeholders to try and achieve some type of agreement about the pilot project and the types of assessments that will be provided and how they will be accepted more broadly across the province and the country.
So we were addressing question number 3 specifically, which was how do you think the credential assessment would be useful to refugees or to your organization? Mostly this is regulators at this table. So in general, everybody was very positive about this process and felt that it was, in general, would be very beneficial. In particular, it would provide a level of consistency in methodology and outcome that regulators could use in whatever way they see fit. It would provide a detailed process that was well documented that we could make available to potential applicants to address sort of the transparency. It would be great, especially for smaller regulators, to be able to take advantage of the resources that WES has in terms of expertise, and also WES to provide resources for smaller regulatory bodies in taking the burden of cost off of the regulators by doing all the research and building the background of information for this process. And even if regulators didn't totally accept the WES assessment as being equivalent to a traditional WES assessment, it would be something that they could build on, and they definitely would use it and take it to inform whatever process they use. And from the point of view of my particular regulatory body, it would be great to have this process for the academic part of our regulatory framework, and then we would sort of build on that with other processes to get people up to the professional level. We sort of have a 2-stage process, one of recognizing the academics and then building on that to get the work experience to get them actually to the professional licensing level. So I think that covers most of what we said here.
At this table we were a lot of people from regulatory bodies, so I suppose firstly we all agree that this is a great initiative that WES have taken. Our next big thing is to find out the full step-by-step process on what is the alternative assessment actually going to contain. what's it going to look like at the end. And a big thing that we spoke about was how it will be used by the end user, in particularly employers, as we touched on earlier on. So more so for people who are not going through regulatory bodies because they come out with their license or their designation, but for people who are going directly into the workforce, and in order to educate employers so that they view this alternative assessment pretty much the same as full recognition, even though we're all kind of aware it's not. But many people at our table felt that it still should be at a high level, because we don't want employers to say, well, this isn't the same as full recognition, and just kind of step away from it and not take it on board. I suppose the other things we were saying in terms of regulatory bodies anyway, is just this new initiative by WES will help us as a regulatory body maybe follow what they're doing or take on board some of their steps now when it comes to us actually reviewing transcripts or assessing transcripts that come into us, or for any of our internationally trained accountants, like for me, for CPA Ontario. So I think this will be a big thing, that we will use what WES are starting and engage that in our new processes and guidelines.
We explored all of the questions, but the one we're going to be talking about now is question number 2, which is, what has been your experience working with refugees and their qualifications? I think everybody at the table is very excited and supportive of the work that WES is doing, and excited to be part of it. It sounds to me, and I'm new in the sector, so I'm learning as I go along as well, but it sounds to me like there are 2 situations that are emerging, particularly with the Syrian refugees, in that it sounds historically there's a chronology that happens when a newcomer comes to the country, and language is often the first point of entry, and so that's one step, and then the next step is, once your language is there, then job readiness becomes, I think, the follow-through. It sounds to me like with the current situation, or what I've learned, is that this is really going to be happening in parallel, so the language and the work will be happening together, because to invite or ask someone to sit back for a year when a lot of their identity and their purpose is driven by being in work can be quite vulnerable to these folks to maybe do the underemployment or work in under the table type roles that would further increase their vulnerability. And then the second piece is how do we access or leverage the work that WES is doing, but what's already available through some of the work and the programs that are embedded in the existing bridging programs, and then how do we make sure that everybody is fully aware of what's available so that we're best able to support the newcomer as they come and look for work. Table, did I do okay? Okay, thank you.
Here at Table 2, we were predominantly employment service providers. We focused on question 8, talking about recommendations. So a few things we would recommend was, as a pilot, it will also be interesting to include a segment of non-Syrian refugees. And this is probably not officially opening it to all refugees, but it is an opportunity to assess if it would work with other countries and other refugees down the road. Whatever is being done now can actually continue when we're serving other refugees. Also, the importance of involving employers in the conversation to assess value of this type of assessments, but and also including ongoing education of employers on the full recognition, and also on what is being done with the alternative assessments as well. There was also a recommendation on exercising caution on how the project is advertised as only for Syrian refugees, as this could cause some conflict or on other refugee claimants, other type of immigrants as well. Otherwise, there's so much focus and so much being done for Syrian refugees when there's other people that also need that support. Looking at the opportunity to test the value of these assessments as decision influencers on hiring, when hiring, so for employers. So with the WES assessment, we talked about the possibility of having either supporting documentation or some sort of write-up or rationale attached to the report, so that would increase the value of it, and pretty much see if that would add value to employers in terms of recognizing these new type of assessments. There's also building on existing partnerships to ensure positive outcomes and recognition of the assessments, especially with regulatory bodies, making sure that everyone is on the same page and everyone's on board and making sure that they are recognized at all levels. And determining the length of time that each assessment would take to produce to ensure that people are not kept in limbo and expectations are properly managed. So essentially determining the service standards that will come out of this.
I'm at table 3, and we addressed question 6, which is what information would be helpful for WES to collect with the application and include with the assessment report. So we first started with issues surrounding literacy and English language proficiency. So we all agreed that there needs to be some documentation of perhaps when an English proficiency test was completed, where it was completed, what the results were, and then also the question around potentially paying for an English proficiency test, if WES could somehow accommodate that. We also suggested that perhaps a record of employment would be helpful. So even a supervisor letter or a letter from a colleague, reference letters, which we know are difficult to confirm at times, but might be helpful. Perhaps letters from professors or fellow students, published work, if there's any chance of finding published work like thesis work online. We discussed looking at the Norway model for capturing information on a particular type of form. Having applicants submit a resume or a CV with sort of detailed month-to-month activities down to that level of detail. In any type of form or resume or CV, it would be important to really cover the gaps. For example, from secondary school graduation on to the present day. So really having the individual account for all of their time. Any copies of licenses or registration would be useful. Copies of, for example, any photo ID from an institution that could indicate that they were in fact registered somewhere. And then finally, just a last thought was perhaps consideration to having a notary or commissioner of oaths on staff that could help to facilitate interviews or statutory declarations and make it a little easier for these folks.
This is also a table of regulators, and in general, everybody's very supportive of this initiative and the importance of doing something in a proactive way before these the Syrian refugees hit in any significant number, which they haven't yet, but we expect that they will. In particular, we were looking at question 5, which was the further steps that an institution might take if they got one of these reports. And there's general consensus that we already, the regulators already look to WES reports or WES assessments for people for whom we cannot get official documents, and that this would probably be treated as in the same way. Although we would note to the regulators that it did come through a different process. And that could result in some additional recommendations, such as interviews or additional skill testing or working under supervision for a period of time. We also look for grades, and we also need to assess for competency, so it could lead to challenge exam options, for example. And the extent to that happen would depend on what was in the report, but generally speaking, we would like to see a picture of what general qualifications program looks like in the country, because for the most part the people who are coming would have been through their normal qualification process before things went bad, and then the idea of what individual achievements probably are. A lot of other ideas have already been expressed, but the one that hasn't, that I would like to just call out, is that to build on the importance of doing this on a proactive basis, it would be helpful if there was some research on the distribution of professions in education within the refugee group, so that we could identify regulators who maybe should be prepared for applicants, Syrian applicants, that may not be aware yet.
Our table was made up of
folks from the post-secondary education sector, and we felt, and some other folks in there as well. Good collaboration between WES and the post-secondary education, and we have a Fairness Commission person at the table as well. But we need more guidance in this and even more collaboration so that the, best practices can be established in that sector for sure. And we focused on question number 4. And we talked about having sector by sector as we're establishing processes to get the right people in the room. So maybe it's the VP academic or the VP student services as well as the registrars from our different institutions. And maybe go to them once there's a bit of a plan established and then run it past that small group to figure out what the pushback would be. Maybe different from college to university, maybe different from geographical areas or those kinds of things. We also talked a lot about PLAR and transfer credit and how all of those types of things would work. And we felt it would be helpful for WES to say how they arrived at decisions, like what the process was that they went, because we will have some academics that will want to know that. And one last point, just because I know we're wrapping up, how is fraud going to be addressed in this pilot? Someone saying, you know, I can't get my documents, but actually there's maybe nothing wrong with the school that they went to, and there may be situations like that arise.
Well, thank you, everybody. There is obviously a great deal more that could be talked about today and that will be talked about and done going forward. Listening to all of this, I'm left with 2 words. The first is excitement. I think there is a general sense of excitement that this pilot project is underway, that this crucially important issue is being tackled, and there's real pride and commitment and involvement on all parts. The other word for me is impatience. There's a desire to have it finished. I don't mean everyone's credentials assessed and in place, but to have all of the criteria, all of the procedures, all of the agreements among different sectors of how to use the results of these assessments all completed and agreed to and finished. This is only the beginning of a pilot, and we can't ask too much too soon. It has to be done right, or we will jeopardize the receptivity of the ongoing enterprise. We need to be impatient to keep the fire under the feet of these remarkable WES staff who are the front lines of all of this. But we have to be reasonable in that impatience and not expect more than can be delivered in the short run. But it is an exciting adventure that all of us are in. I want to thank the WES staff in particular, not just for today's event, but for this initiative. It's exciting for me to be secondhand involved with it as a member of the board. It's exciting for all of us in the room to be part of. I want to thank some key people who helped to organize today, recognizing that ignores a whole lot of other people, but especially Sarah from the Toronto office, Denise, Elisa, and Juna from the New York office, and above all, Marcus Parmigiani, the Senior Manager of Program Development and Partnerships at WES Canada, who is the contact person for this whole pilot project and who I will call on right now.
So I stand between you and lunch, so I'm going to keep it as brief as possible, although I will say that I think Sarah and Juna and the other folks deserve way more credit than I do, especially Sarah. So I wanted to say a couple of things before closing this out. As David mentioned, I will be the primary person responsible for coordinating the pilot. And all through this, I've been thinking about one thing that really strikes me I mean, about the initiative and how significant an impact we potentially can have with this. Obviously, there's a huge potential impact on our economy in terms of having a class of underemployed, underpaid people is not going to benefit anyone. I mean, it's a bit abstract to us, but we know it's there. But I think the other piece is the real potential impact on the lives of people, the real lived experiences of the people that arrive here, new Canadians and new Americans who come as refugees. And I wanted to take a moment just to think about, and reflect back. I think Tim touched on it this morning, but about what that experience could be like and, what this could do for it. I think what it would be like to be stripped of, somebody like me, like all of us in this room, to be stripped of your educational qualifications. Suddenly you show up somewhere where you may not have much familiarity with the language, the culture, and as far as anyone's concerned, when you're trying to find employment or do something, you're no better than maybe you have a high school graduation. They may not even consider that as part of your qualification base. I think, also if you're forced into all of this, what that impact that'll have on you and your family. Where will you be able to find a place to live and feed your family if suddenly you're reduced to half, maybe less of your previous salary? You no longer have that identity. If you were an engineer or if you were someone significant, you felt like you're a person of status of some kind in the country where you came from. It doesn't take much to understand and to see just how devastating that would be personally, let alone financially. And I think we can all agree that being a refugee shouldn't be a life sentence of struggle, right? That suddenly all those things are gone and you're going to struggle for the rest of your life once you arrived. This is supposed to be kind of refuge from that place and from those problems. So I think the reality we're trying to change, it makes this a really important agenda. There'll be real people affected if we manage to succeed at what we're trying to do. And I know we can't solve every problem in every aspect of this, but I think through the partnership and the collaboration that's coming, it's in evidence in this room, and through thoughtful design, because that's extremely important, as David mentioned. It needs to work, it needs to be realistic, it needs to deliver something of value. And I think together we can make significant progress in resolving that issue of refugee credential recognition. So as Tim mentioned earlier, as we move forward on the initiative, some of the ways that we can build partnerships are to refer refugees to us, to become a referral partner, to help us refine this alternative credential assessment, whether it's for regulatory body purposes or for academic purposes, and support efforts to help clients understand their options and find appropriate employment. So before closing out and going to lunch, I wanted to mention a couple of things. One is that the full report is available on the USB in the pen that you have in your folders. There's a bunch of key documents in there as well. And the second thing is that please take the time to fill out the survey that's in the package. There will also be an online survey. We'd really appreciate your candid feedback. And there is a wonderful lunch upcoming. It does have veal parmesan, and I swear I don't collect any royalties or anything. It's just on the menu. Thank you very much for all your participation and for coming today.